Not everyone abandons love because they've stopped feeling something. Sometimes leaving is simply a survival mechanism, a silent decision made by someone who isn't bitter, isn't broken, isn't too traumatized to try again, but is deeply tired. Tired of investing without return, tired of explaining themselves, tired of hoping that this time will be different, only to accumulate yet another small disappointment that no one else noticed. This kind of resignation doesn't come from a single dramatic romantic disappointment. It's born from the accumulation, the slow weight of unmet expectations, unrequited efforts, and emotional labor that never balances. And perhaps you recognize this place. Perhaps you've reached a point where you didn't want to try anymore, not because you were afraid of getting hurt, but because you were exhausted from always being the one trying. This isn't a story about finding someone, about a new beginning wrapped in romance or promises. It's about what happens when someone stops searching, stops chasing, stops forcing meaning into empty spaces and chooses to rest. And it is in this pause, in this silent recollection, that life sometimes decides to follow its own path, not to reward effort, not to cure loneliness, but to reveal something unexpected. Stay with this story, not to learn a lesson, not to receive orders, but to feel understood before anything else happens, because sometimes being seen is more important than being taught. Giving up on love is rarely a dramatic decision. It doesn't happen in one conversation, one breakup, or one night of clarity. It happens slowly, quietly, almost politely, until one day you notice something that feels unfamiliar. You meet someone new and there is no excitement, no curiosity, no inner movement, just a neutral acknowledgement and the sense that you already know how this story goes. Hope doesn't shatter. It fades, and indifference takes its place not because you became cold, but because you became tired. It's like an app you once believed in, one you downloaded with expectation, updated again and again, trusted after every promised improvement, only to watch it crash every single time until eventually you stop updating it, not out of anger but out of resignation. You don't delete it in a dramatic moment. You just stop checking. And this isn't about romanticizing cynicism or glorifying emotional distance. It's about normalizing the moment when someone steps back not because they hate love, but because they've invested enough to know the cost. No one wakes up one day deciding to give up on love, because giving up is never a starting point. It's an arrival, the final stop of a long, silent process of exhaustion that happens far before the goodbye is spoken out loud. Before the decision, there is accumulation, unanswered expectations, repeated disappointments, emotional labor that is never fully seen, and a constant effort to keep things alive with less and less energy. Love doesn't usually end in a dramatic moment. It fades in the invisible routine of trying, adjusting, forgiving, and hoping without feeling met in the same measure. It's like a phone that works all day without warning, sending messages, opening apps, doing everything it's asked to do, until suddenly at night, it shuts down completely. From the outside, it looks abrupt, unexplained, almost cruel, but the battery was draining for hours. The shutdown wasn't a choice, it was a consequence, and when someone finally says, "I can't anymore," they're not announcing a sudden change of heart. They're revealing a fatigue that has been there for a long time, quietly consuming what once felt endless. Sometimes giving up isn't bitterness, it's self-protection learning to breathe. She wasn't sad, she was quiet. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because silence is often mistaken for emptiness when, in reality, it can be the aftermath of emotional noise that lasted too long. What she felt wasn't the ache of loneliness, but the stillness that comes after something intense finally ends, like standing alone in a room after a party that went on for hours longer than it should have. The music is gone, the voices disappeared, the lights feel harsher than before, and for the first time there's space to hear your own thoughts without interruption. That space can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, especially for someone who spent so long surrounded by expectations, conversations, emotional demands, and unspoken roles. From the outside, it looked like withdrawal, like distance, like something was missing. But inside, It was adjustment. It was her nervous system learning how to exist without constant stimulation, her emotions recalibrating after being stretched for too long. Peace doesn't always arrive softly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as absence, as boredom, as a strange calm that feels unfamiliar because chaos became normal. This is where the confusion begins, because society teaches that happiness is loud, expressive, visible, while quiet is immediately labeled as a problem to be fixed. But not all quiet is loneliness, and not all calm means something is wrong. Sometimes it's simply the moment when a person realizes they no longer need to fill every silence to feel alive. The empty cups on the table don't mean the night failed. They mean it ended. The silence doesn't mean she lost something. It means she finally has room to notice herself again. And learning to stay in that quiet without rushing to escape it is often the first sign that peace is forming, slowly, without drama, without witnesses, and without needing to be explained. Stopping the search didn't come from hopelessness. It came from exhaustion, the kind that builds quietly after investing emotion where nothing truly settles. And that's why stopping is so often misunderstood as giving up, when in reality, it's an act of emotional intelligence. To stop looking is not to stop believing. It's to recognize that constantly searching drains more than it gives, that every expectation placed into the wrong space leaks energy you never get back. For a long time, the search felt productive, almost noble, as if effort alone could summon meaning, connection, or clarity. But over time it became clear that the search itself was keeping her restless, always leaning forward, never fully present, always scanning for what was missing instead of noticing what remained. Parar de procurar is not closing the door, it's sitting down, lowering the shoulders, and allowing the nervous system to rest after being on alert for too long. It's realizing that emotional energy is finite, and spending it indiscriminately leaves nothing for growth, healing, or self-recognition. This decision didn't come with certainty or relief at first. It came with space, and space can feel unsettling when you're used to motion. But in that stillness, something shifted. The pressure to find was replaced by permission to exist without an objective, without a timeline, without the constant internal question of, what's next? Stopping the search didn't make life smaller, it made it quieter. And in that quiet, she could finally hear herself again. What looked like resignation from the outside was actually conservation, a deliberate choice to stop pouring emotion into places that echoed back nothing. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't chasing, fixing, or proving, but choosing to pause, to protect your energy, and to trust that what is meant to meet you doesn't require constant pursuit. There is a moment most people never talk about, because it feels contradictory and even shameful to admit. The instant relief that comes when you stop waiting. Not when you get what you hoped for, not when things finally work out, but when you quietly decide that you're done expecting anything at all. At first, it doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like air returning to your lungs after holding your breath for too long. The tension loosens, the mental calculations stop, the endless what-if scenarios finally go silent. You realize how much energy was being spent on anticipation, on checking signs, on reading pauses, on interpreting silence as possibility. Letting go doesn't arrive as sadness. It arrives as stillness, as a sudden absence of pressure. And that's why it's confusing, because we're taught that giving up should hurt immediately, that it should feel like failure, like collapse. But often the first thing it brings is peace. Not the joyful kind, not the celebratory kind, but a neutral calm that feels unfamiliar because hope had become a constant background noise. This relief doesn't mean nothing mattered, and it doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped negotiating with uncertainty. Only later does the emptiness show up, gently, honestly, once the nervous system understands that the waiting is truly over. But that initial peace is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. It's the body thanking you for choosing rest over suspense, certainty over fantasy, and self-respect over endless expectation. Desistance in this sense isn't weakness. It's the moment you step out of emotional limbo and return to yourself. Life doesn't stop to acknowledge emotional endings. It keeps moving with a consistency that can feel almost cruel when something meaningful quietly dissolves inside you. Work still demands attention. Friends still invite you out. Routines still fill the hours, and mornings continue to arrive on schedule, indifferent to what you lost or let go of. At first, this continuity feels strange, even offensive, as if the world should pause out of respect for what mattered to you. But slowly, something else becomes clear. Life continuing is not a betrayal of the feeling. It's a structure that holds you when romance no longer does. Days give you shape when emotions feel formless. Tasks ground you when thoughts drift too far into what could have been. The train keeps moving even when no new passengers step on, not because the journey lost meaning, but because motion itself is part of survival. You sit there, looking out the window, watching familiar landscapes pass by, carrying the memory of someone who once shared the ride, and that memory doesn't derail the train. It travels with you quietly, without demanding attention at every stop. This is where many people fear they are moving on too fast, confusing continuity with indifference. But continuing is not forgetting. It's learning how to live without rearranging your entire existence around absence. Life doesn't require romance to function, and that realization can feel both sobering and freeing. It shows you that connection enhances life, but it is not the engine that keeps it running. The tracks were there before, and they remain after, guiding you forward even when no new story boards the train. One of the most persistent mistakes people make is believing that love only arrives when it is actively sought, as if connection were a reward for effort, strategy, or constant pursuit. This belief transforms love into a task, something to be chased, optimized, and controlled, and in doing so, silently strips it of its most defining quality: spontaneity. When you are convinced that love depends on the pursuit, every interaction becomes laden with intention. Every silence becomes a threat, and every delay feels like a rejection. You stop being present and start performing, measuring your worth by responses, time, and results. But the truth is that most meaningful connections don't begin with a chase, but rather with alignment. They happen when two people are fully occupied with their own lives, not seeking to complete the horizon, not trying to fill a void, but simply existing as they are. Love that arrives in this way doesn't announce itself to the four winds. It insinuates itself silently, by coincidence, by routine, through moments that weren't planned to change anything. That's why seeking love with too much intensity often leads to disappointment, not because love is rare, but because expectation distorts perception. When you abandon the idea that love needs to be pursued, you open space for it to recognize you. And this change breaks the central belief of this story. Love doesn't respond to urgency, but rather to authenticity, and tends to arrive precisely when you stop trying to force it to happen. Destiny, when it arrives, rarely presents itself as a promise. There's no music swelling in the background, no clear signs flashing on the horizon, no ready-made phrases saying that now everything will make sense. It doesn't ask permission, doesn't send prior notice, doesn't worry about being recognized at the moment it happens. Sometimes, destiny enters the scene while you're too busy trying to fix another part of your life. Like a door that opens silently while you're tidying up something else in the same room, it doesn't draw attention, it doesn't interrupt, it just changes the airflow. You only notice it later, when the environment is no longer the same. At that moment, you don't understand the importance, you don't recognize the impact, you don't imagine the consequences. Everything seems too ordinary to carry meaning, but destiny doesn't work with spectacles. It works with subtle shifts. It alters directions while you believe you're just following the routine. And when you finally look back, you realize that that open door wasn't a detail, it was the entire passage. There is a very specific kind of discomfort that appears when you feel something after you were sure that chapter was closed. It doesn't arrive as excitement or hope, but as resistance. A quiet inner conflict that whispers, "I didn't want to feel this anymore." Not because the feeling is wrong, but because it threatens the stability you fought so hard to build. You remember the nights you spent convincing yourself that you were better off numb, the mornings where indifference felt like progress, the relief of not expecting anything from anyone. And then, without permission, something shifts. A look lingers too long. A conversation stays with you after it ends. A presence awakens parts of you that were intentionally put to sleep. The discomfort isn't the feeling itself, but what it represents, the risk of reopening doors you sealed to survive. Your mind reacts first, listing reasons, warning signs, reminding you of past disappointments as if logic could silence the body. But the body remembers what the mind chose to forget. The heart recognizes patterns before explanations are formed. And that's where the conflict intensifies. You're no longer deciding whether to feel. You're deciding whether to fight what's already happening. This is the moment where many retreat, not because they don't care, but because caring once cost them too much. Feeling again feels like betrayal of the version of yourself that learned to let go. Yet the discomfort persists, not to punish you, but to reveal something honest. You didn't stop feeling because you healed. You stopped because you were protecting yourself. And now, the discomfort isn't asking you to dive in blindly. It's asking you to acknowledge that part of you is still alive, still responsive, still capable of connection. Whether you act on it or not, this moment exists to remind you that numbness was never the goal. It was only a pause. Emotional resistance to the new almost never seems like fear. It disguises itself as logic, maturity, excessive caution. It arises the moment something starts to get too close, and even before there is a real threat, the mind kicks in to protect what it already knows. That's where the silent habit of creating flaws is born. Small annoyances take on enormous proportions, irrelevant details become warning signs, and everything is analyzed with an emotional magnifying glass that only sees flaws. Not because they are too big, but because the possibility of feeling again seems too risky. The new is not rejected for what it is, but for what it can cause. Getting involved requires giving up control, and for those who have already learned to survive emotionally, control has become synonymous with security. This experience repeats itself almost automatically. When the connection begins to grow, the mind rushes to the inventory of flaws as if looking for an emergency exit. A comment becomes a reason, a silence becomes proof. A difference becomes definitive incompatibility. It's not about the other person, it's about the need to maintain emotional distance without confronting fear up close. Creating flaws becomes an unconscious strategy to interrupt the advancement of the bond before it becomes too deep. Thus, the internal narrative remains intact. It wasn't fear, it was discretion, it wasn't escape, it was rational choice. In this way, the person preserves the image of control while avoiding the risk of truly getting involved. Over time, this resistance creates a pattern that is difficult to perceive from within. The desire for connection continues to exist, but it always runs up against well-constructed justifications. The new is always almost enough, almost right, almost ideal, but it never crosses this invisible limit. Creating flaws becomes an efficient, yet lonely, emotional shield. It prevents pain, but it also blocks the possibility of something different happening. Resistance to the new doesn't scream, doesn't cause chaos, doesn't generate external conflict. She acts silently, convincing the person that she is protecting herself, when in reality she is only repeating the same emotional distance with different faces, different stories, and the same outcome. The feeling that something could always have been, but never was. She didn't want to lose the stability she had built alone. That stability wasn't just financial or practical, it was emotional architecture, carefully assembled after disappointment, silence, and recovery. Every routine had a purpose. Every habit was a wall holding something fragile in place. Control became a language she spoke fluently. Not because she loved it, but because it kept the ground from shifting beneath her feet. Letting go felt dangerous, almost irresponsible, like loosening a grip while standing at the edge of something deep. She had learned that depending on no one was safer than trusting the wrong person. and that self-sufficiency could feel like peace if you didn't question it too closely. The struggle wasn't about love versus fear. It was about order versus uncertainty. Control promised predictability, and predictability promised survival. Giving that up felt like erasing proof of how far she had come, as if opening space for someone else meant invalidating the strength it took to stand alone. But surrender doesn't announce itself as weakness. It disguises itself as risk. The real battle wasn't losing what she built. It was accepting that stability can expand instead of collapse. Control demands constant vigilance, while surrender asks for trust in movement rather than structure. She wasn't afraid of loving, she was afraid of destabilizing the system that finally worked. Yet life doesn't grow inside rigid frames. It breathes through flexibility. Holding everything together alone had protected her, but it had also limited her. The tension lived in that exact space, between honoring the woman who survived by controlling every variable, and allowing herself to believe that stability doesn't disappear when shared. Sometimes it evolves. Sometimes the strongest choice isn't tightening the grip, but loosening it just enough to discover that what you built was never meant to be a fortress, but a foundation capable of carrying more than one heartbeat. The fear of starting over is almost never about the other person. It doesn't stem from the possibility of being hurt again, nor from doubt about the intentions of someone new. The real fear arises when you realize you've learned to live without anyone, that you've built an emotional routine based on self-sufficiency, silence, and control. Starting over requires dismantling a fortress that took time to build. Not because it's perfect, but because it's safe. When you learn not to wait for messages, not to depend on presence, not to share decisions, you create a territory where everything is under your command. Allowing someone into that space doesn't just threaten the past, it threatens the identity that was created to survive. And that's why fear is confusing. It seems like apprehension of the other person, but it's resistance to abandoning the version of yourself that has learned to endure everything alone. Trusting someone after learning to live without anyone is like relearning a movement that the body has unlearned for defense. In the beginning, everything seems awkward, slow, uncomfortable. You measure your words, calculate your gestures, anticipate exits, not because the other person gave signs of danger, but because you know how much it costs to stand on your own 2 feet. Emotional independence, when born from pain, is not complete freedom. It is adaptation. It teaches you not to ask, not to show, not to expect. Starting over, then, doesn't just require courage to love. It requires courage to dismantle the protective mechanisms that once saved you. And that hurts, because abandoning the armor means admitting that you don't just want to survive. You want to feel again. Deep down, the fear of starting over is the fear of seeing yourself vulnerable after having become strong by force. It's the fear of not recognizing your own reaction to care, to presence, to constancy. When someone new approaches, the conflict isn't in the trust that will be given, but in the silent question that arises. Who am I without these defenses? Starting over doesn't just test the relationship, it tests the identity built during the period of absence. And perhaps that's why so many people run away when everything starts to become possible. It's not because they don't want the other person. It's because they know that to move on, they will have to abandon the version they learned to live without anyone, and face themselves head on. There is a type of love that breaks all the patterns learned throughout life. It doesn't beg for space, doesn't force its presence, doesn't demand constant proof that it's important. Unlike noisy feelings, this love doesn't invade, doesn't occupy everything at once, doesn't try to justify itself. It simply remains. And that's exactly what's confusing. Because we were taught to recognize love by its impact, by its urgency, by the fear of losing it. But this love works differently. It doesn't chase after you, doesn't compete for attention, it doesn't turn the relationship into an emotional battlefield. It settles in as something solid, silent, almost invisible to the eyes of those who expect intensity as proof. There are no exaggerated promises, no dramatization, no attempts to convince. There is only constancy, And for many, that seems like little. For others, that's everything. This love doesn't ask permission to exist, but it also doesn't invade territories that haven't been offered to it. The pattern break happens when the feeling doesn't try to occupy every empty space in the other person. It doesn't feed on neediness. It doesn't grow from lack. It doesn't strengthen itself with the fear of abandonment. On the contrary, it respects silence, understands time, accepts limits without turning them into rejection. This love doesn't enter like a storm. It enters like a presence that you only notice when you think about what its absence would be like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't sell itself. It remains even when it's not observed. And that changes everything. Because instead of creating dependence, it creates security. Instead of generating anxiety, it generates calm. There's no need to prove worth all the time. There are no emotional games, no disputes for attention. This love doesn't take up too much space, but it also doesn't leave a void. It fits. And that's exactly why it's frightening. The love that doesn't beg for space teaches a silent lesson. True feelings don't need to be defended all the time. They don't need to shout to exist. They don't require constant effort to stay alive. They survive the everyday, the boredom, the routine, and the ordinary days. This love doesn't grow in excess, it grows in permanence. It's not the kind that arrives to change everything at once. It's the kind that stays when nothing else seems extraordinary. It doesn't promise. It doesn't threaten to leave. It doesn't use absence as a weapon. It simply is. And when you realize it, you understand that it wasn't won over by intensity, but by consistency. Because the love that doesn't beg for space doesn't want to occupy your entire life. It wants to be a part of it. And that, for someone accustomed to chaos, is the biggest pattern break of all. The final understanding doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as clarity. She didn't wake up one day deciding that love was no longer worth it. Nor did she harden her heart against connection, affection, or hope. What ended was not love itself, but a distorted version of it that demanded too much and gave too little back. She didn't abandon the feeling. She abandoned the illusion. The version of love she walked away from was built on waiting, on self-erasure, on constantly proving her value to someone who never fully showed up. Over time, love became heavy instead of nourishing, confusing instead of safe. And slowly, without drama or declarations, she understood something crucial. Staying was costing her more than leaving. Letting go wasn't an act of bitterness. It was an act of discernment. She realized that love should not require shrinking, silencing, or constant doubt. So she didn't close her heart. She simply stopped offering it to a place where it could not grow. This is where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like she gave up. It looks like she chose solitude over connection, distance over vulnerability. But the truth is more precise and more honest. She didn't give up on love. She gave up on the wrong version of it. She stopped confusing intensity with depth, absence with mystery, inconsistency with fate. What she rejected was a pattern that kept repeating the same ending under different names. In doing so, she made space for a love that doesn't demand endurance as proof, that doesn't feel like a test you're always failing. This understanding marks the real turning point of the story. Not the end of romance, but the end of self-betrayal. Because when someone stops chasing the wrong version of love, they are not closing a chapter. They are finally making room for the right one to begin. Destiny doesn't push, doesn't pressure, doesn't demand proof of resistance. It doesn't knock on the door when you're still picking up the pieces of the version you had to break to survive. What is true doesn't arrive as a demand, it arrives as a fit. It doesn't ask you to go back to being the person who accepted less, who silenced pain, who molded themselves to fit the fear of losing. Destiny finds you at the exact point where you no longer need to diminish yourself to be accepted. That's why, often, it seems late. In fact, it's waiting for you to stop negotiating your own integrity. What is real doesn't demand sacrifice of your essence, doesn't ask you to betray yourself again. doesn't force you to relive wounds just to prove loyalty. When something is destiny, it recognizes who you have become, not who you were when you were still broken. There is a profound difference between insisting and being found. Insisting is going back to places where you've already bled, trying to convince the past to change. Being found is realizing that nothing needed to be forced, because everything happened in the time when you were already whole. Destiny doesn't ask you to rebuild yourself to fit someone else. It appears when you've already rebuilt yourself for yourself. That's why what's true doesn't come with constant anxiety, nor with the fear of making a mistake and losing everything. It comes calmly, clearly, with the silent feeling that you don't need to shrink. Destiny doesn't test until it breaks. It confirms. It doesn't demand old versions. It honors the version that survived, learned, and chose not to abandon itself anymore. She gave up. And that wasn't weakness. It was survival instinct. Giving up at that moment didn't mean abandoning love, but interrupting the cycle of losing herself trying to be enough. She needed to protect herself because continuing to wait like that meant continuing to hurt herself. Destiny didn't appear to fix her, because she was never broken, just tired of molding herself to fit empty promises. The true encounter didn't come as rescue, it came as recognition. It arrived when she already knew how to be alone without feeling incomplete, when she no longer begged for attention, when silence no longer scared her. Destiny doesn't come to save those drowning in expectations. It finds those who have learned to swim on their own. And that's why nothing needed to be forced, explained, or proven. Everything just happened, without demanding that she go back to being who she once was, hurting herself trying to love the wrong way. Sometimes love doesn't arrive when you believe. It arrives when you stop begging. That's the truth that almost no one accepts at the beginning. Not romanticizing waiting means understanding that standing still can also be a way of getting lost. Not demonizing giving up means recognizing that leaving, at certain times, is an act of self-respect. Emotional time doesn't follow clocks, it follows maturity. It doesn't respond to urgency, it responds to clarity. When you understand this, you realize that nothing was a delay, rejection, or punishment. It was preparation. Destiny didn't fail by not arriving sooner. You just weren't whole yet. And when you finally are, what is true doesn't ask for proof of pain, doesn't demand inhuman sacrifices, doesn't demand old versions. It remains, because it finds someone who has already learned not to abandon themselves for anyone. Before moving on, let this question stay with you for a few seconds. Have you ever given up on something, and only then realized that it wasn't the end? It was just the wrong way to wait. Because there are giving ups that don't end stories. They only end illusions. There are times when stopping isn't failure. It's a course correction. Many times, you haven't abandoned the dream, the love, or the hope. You've simply stopped hurting yourself by trying to force a time that wasn't yet possible. This question doesn't ask for a quick answer. It asks for honesty. It exists to touch that silent point where you know you did the best you could with the awareness you had at that moment. And recognizing this is an important step to move on without guilt, without romanticizing the pain, and without carrying burdens that were never yours. If this story spoke to you, write in the comments, "I understand." Not as a response to the video, but as a recognition for yourself. Sometimes understanding is already healing, and if you want to continue listening to stories that don't promise perfect endings but make sense, subscribe to the channel. Here, there are no magic solutions, only narratives that respect the emotional time of those who live, feel, and learn. Stories that don't push empty hope, but offer clarity. Because not every ending needs to be happy. Some just need to be true.